Welcome to Trust AI Partners, where we dive into the cutting edge of tech innovation. Join us as we explore how AI automation is transforming the industry. If you're ready to discover the future of AI innovation and how your company can get ahead, stay tuned and connect with us for more information. I'm your host, Jim Hoover, and joining us today is David Esposito, President and CEO of ONL Therapeutics, a clinical stage biotech advancing novel therapies to protect retinal cells and preserve vision in blinding eye diseases. A former U.S. Army officer turned healthcare leader, David has scaled multiple life sciences companies through key clinical and commercial milestones. At ONL, he's leading development on a first-in-class fast apoptosis inhibitors aimed at addressing acute and chronic retinal conditions. David holds a degree from West Point and an MBA from Syracuse University. He's an active mentor and board advisor across the healthcare ecosystem. David, welcome to the show. Would you introduce yourself and share what ONL Therapeutics is focused on right now?
Sure, Jim. Thanks for the income and glad I'll be on your podcast. Really happy to participate today. I'm David Esposito, as you mentioned, CEO of ONL Therapeutics. So ONL is based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're what you would call maybe a typical academic university spinout. So our founders are retina specialists, a clinician scientist at the University of Michigan, David Zaks, that developed an understanding of this pathway that you mentioned, the fast pathway in retinal disease, so that over time we developed drugs that basically protect retinal cells by blocking that pathway. So when there's stress in the eye for diseases your audience may be familiar with, things like glaucoma or age-related macular degeneration, we've developed drugs that block this pathway and protect those retinal cells regardless of the stress or disease they're under. We're active in human clinical trials right now, a big phase 2 study, and looking for positive results in the few years to come.
That's a good summary and overview. And so zooming out on the business today, what's the single biggest pain point that you're navigating in ONL's path?
Sure. So I think we're a privately held biotech company. So I can't not describe, hey, we got to raise capital to do these things. You know, we don't have a revenue generating business. So we are raising capital. We have recently raised a Series D round of capital. It's pretty tough markets right now. It's never easy raising capital, but it's pretty tough right now. But we've raised sufficient capital to run this trial. And so when it comes down to executing the trial, it's a both U.S. and European, a global trial. And right now, the most challenging pain point is we've got to enroll a little bit over 320 patients over the next 12 months. So the ability to identify those patients and get them qualified and in our trial is important. You touched on AI. I mean, there's a number of tools right now that are helping to address that pain point of identifying the right patients, but they're still not optimal. And this is a classic game of you got to open up a lot of sites, encourage sites to look for those patients, and then you hope you have a courageous 320 plus patients that want to sign up for an investigative trial.
And how would you characterize the current state of the company in terms of the stage that you're at? And I know you just mentioned part about the funding component of it, but maybe you could elaborate a little bit further, or in terms of the general team composition.
Sure, no, glad to. So we started out typical biotech company with a university spinout, 2-3 folks around the table. And that's how you start them. And typically there are scientists around the table. I'm more of a business commercial guy over the years that at some point you bring the science into a stage where you need help in building the story and then ultimately raising capital. So over the course of the years, to give you a perspective, that's how the company started. We're now over 15 people. Most of them are focused on clinical operations. So running these trials are a pretty heavy lift. Majority of patients or employees we have in Ann Arbor and a few remote folks working in clinical operations. We have our functions of finance and development and research as well. But the bulk of the team is focused on executing the clinical trial. Typically, biotech companies like ours, we outsource a lot of support around and use consultants for things like regulatory, manufacturing. We don't make our own product. We contract with companies to make the product. And we also contract with what would be called a contract research organization, or CRO, that really provides the feet on the ground at the study site standpoint to open up the studies, make sure they're administering the studies properly. So in our stage, try to keep the team as small as you can to make sure, one, we have the capital to execute the trial, to then ultimately hit the kind of milestones that are needed, which in our case in running these trials are, one, get regulatory approval to open up the trial. We're at that stage. We've opened up in the US. And then it's getting a number of study sites online and what would be called activated. So they have all the systems in place, they have all the tools in place. And then the next item is around enrollment. And so, Jim, the typical journey with companies like ours, once you conduct animal studies or what would be called preclinical studies, you now move into human studies. Phase one is the safety studies that you run. We're in phase two right now. So we've passed that stage gate of phase one safety. We're now in phase two, which is predominantly the big studies that are powered to determine safety and efficacy. That's where we're at right now. If things go well for us there, then we would scale the team and then move into phase three studies. Phase three are typically the ones you're filing with, say, for example, the FDA to get FDA approval to ultimately then commercialize the drug in the marketplace. And so, in a long-winded way of describing, we're about in the middle of that journey. We've passed the safety gate. Now this is safety and efficacy. We're a stage away from those final pivotal studies.
And what's the form of the drug itself? Is it liquid or
Sure.
otherwise?
Yeah, so we're in the classification of small molecules. We're a small peptide that's a clear liquid, soluble in a clear liquid, and it's an injection in the eye. So your audience, most people don't want to think about getting needles in the eye. Nobody does, but typically in retinal diseases, so the retina is the back part of the eye, and a very efficient way to get drug into that back of the eye is called what's called an intravitreal injection. So it's a needle in the eye. This procedure has been done for 20 plus years in conditions called wet age-related macular degeneration. So the marketplace, unfortunately, people who have those diseases, they're familiar with it. It's a very safe procedure. These are millions of patients annually getting these injections. It just so happens for people who are not into that space, kind of get a little squirmy thinking about a needle in the eye. But that's the way it is. But it is considered a small molecule, dissolves over time. The repetition of injections, that's usually, Jim, in our world where you try to push out the time period of when people would need those injections. So a little bit of a differentiation for our drug, which is called zelafacilitide, a generic name for that small peptide, is injected every 3 or 6 months. There are some products in the marketplace who are injected every month. We think we have an advantage that patients would appreciate every 3 or 6 month injection.
Mm. Yeah, so that is the sort of the unique value proposition to the drug itself is going to be the frequency and duration of when those shots are going to be required.
Yeah, that's certainly one of them, very much so. The other one is, as what we described briefly in the beginning, just the mechanism of action itself. How does the drug work? So our drug, so on the surface of retinal cells, when they're stressed, that stress activates this fast receptor to trigger the death of retinal cells. Unlike, say, skin cells, where you regenerate skin cells over time, retinal cells, you do not do that. So when those cells die, you're on a slow path to blindness. So many of these diseases, at least the dry age-related macular degeneration that we're working on, you start to notice spots in your vision. That's literally retinal cells dying. And so what our drug does in a very differentiated way, not just the dosing interval, but we block this receptor on the surface of retinal cells. We are upstream of a lot of those issues. So the drug, by blocking those cells, blocking that receptor, protects those retinal cells, and it also quiets the inflammatory response. I mean, yourself, your audience, probably very familiar. You twist an ankle or a knee, things swell up. Things swell up, you have pain, and you have a lot of other problems in there. So what our drug does, it not only protects those cells, it quiets that inflammatory response. So what we see is those retinal cells, even though they may be under stress, can perk back up to better functionality because we've lowered that inflammatory burden. So that mechanism of action, Jim, in addition to the dosing interval, is very well differentiated in the marketplace compared to how other drugs work in this space. And that is what we think is the overall pitch for clinicians and patients to join our trial. It's something new. It's also a significant part of the pitch on why we think the drug could make a real meaningful difference and raise capital to move the trials going forward to the next level.
And so when you look at the total addressable market for the demand for a drug like this, what does that look like domestically or internationally?
These are 5, 10, 15 million patients globally, about 5 million in the US alone. Depending on the developed nature of the marketplace, those numbers may vary around the globe, but you can think about very similar numbers across Europe. Asia, probably 2x those numbers. So these are multi-million patient challenges that can be addressed with this drug. You know, Jim, an interesting fact with dry AMD is that there has never been approved therapies around the world for dry AMD up until just a few years ago. The US approved 2 drugs. So many of these patients, like you or I, would wander into an optometrist to get glasses, get your eyes checked. You'd be identified as having dry age-related macular degeneration. And then the next comment from the physician would be, there's nothing more I can do. There are no drugs on the market to treat this. You're on a slow path to blindness. So an interesting piece about the potential for this market. Yes, there are millions of patients out there, but many of them have been told there's nothing left to do, and they don't return to the doc to get the kind of treatments that are available. So there is a lot of work going on right now in the marketplace to educate both physicians and patients that there are now drugs approved to help slow this disease process. So it's really an interesting dynamic, but bit of a long-winded way to say there's a lot of patients across the globe, and all of them would love to have a drug that are those approved, and hopefully drugs like ours that will get approved that ultimately could slow the progression of this disease.
And so after you get through stage 2 onto stage 3 and get the FDA approval, in looking at your roadmap, are you going to stay focused on targeting the US, or does any part of the roadmap expand beyond that?
Certainly, we're running a global clinical trial, so we hope the data supports a broad-based approval, not just in the U.S., but broadly throughout Europe and Asia as well. So definitely the goal would be to go global with this indication. In addition, as we think about our pipeline and our development plan, we also have on the map open-angle glaucoma. So that's another multi-million patient burden around the globe that we think we could make a meaningful difference in glaucoma as well. So the plans would be, Jim, we make good progress on this phase 2 and move into phase 3, but then we very quickly look at a open angle glaucoma study plan and development plan as well, because those are 2 very large markets, very different disease states, but the way our drug works in that blocking that fast pathway, that's a very common pathway across these diseases. So we think we can get after a multitude of disease states with our same lead compound.
And do you know approximately how many other drugs you're going to be competing with once it is approved?
Great question. So in the dry age-related macular degeneration market, right now there are only 2 approved therapies in the US. Both of those drugs are also working towards global approval. They haven't had broad global approvals yet. So in our timeline, and a couple that may be just a click ahead of us, already starting phase 3 trials, you could envision over the course of the next 3 to 5 years, probably 5 to 7 or so approved drugs in this disease state that we're going after. So, in typical fashion, you got some leaders, and then you got some fast followers in the drug development space. We'd be in that pretty rapid follower space with the drug. And then on the flip side, the open angle glaucoma indication, that is a super crowded market on some traditional ways of treating. We would be the first entrant and a first in class to treat it a new way. So even though it's a crowded market, those products are not quite meeting the needs. So we feel a real opportunity in glaucoma as well.
And so it sounds like the two sort of core priorities right now is, one, you have the funding component, and two, you have the FDA approvals in the clinical trials. I'm curious, one is, what's your timeline at as far as getting the FDA approval? Where are you thinking?
Sure. So this trial we're currently running will probably generate the kind of data to decide whether or not to go into phase 3 trials in about 2 years or so. So you could really add another 3 years onto that. So we're probably talking, 2030, 2031 by the time we could potentially see a regulatory approval to get into the market. It's one of the tough spots on drug development. It takes a little while to run these large trials. If we were looking at an acute condition, you could assess a drug's impact very quickly in a matter of a couple months. But these are large, slow progressing diseases. You need a lot of patience, and you need to watch them for a while, several years, to really show development. So that's a bit of the nature of these big chronic diseases. Just take some time. But we're excited about it, and we've got the capital to get through this next stage gate of phase 2. And typically in our world, if they go well, we pedal the bike fast to raise some more capital to run phase 3 trials.
The long game is an understatement.
That's exactly right. Long game and a lot of capital to keep it going.
Yeah. So let's talk about that capital. Can you walk me through, without sharing anything that might be confidential, what's the strategy on the fundraising component side of the business?
Sure. So, the typical journey of an early stage biotech company, it really begins with an idea, a problem you're trying to solve, and an idea to solve that problem, right? So in our world, it's scientific discovery. Much of that initial discovery work gets funded by grants through the National Institutes of Health, or a number of groups like that. So that's one of the things in all these discussions on government shutdowns and what happens. I mean, the National Institutes of Health does some really good work to start early stage innovation in academic universities like University of Michigan and other places. So once that discovery work is done that way, typically, Jim, it's the normal seed financing, angel financing. So folks like you and I and players on the team chipping in $5,000-$10,000, whatever it is, to get rolling, to get going. And then where we are today with ONL, after that kind of early chipping around, you shake down every friend, family, uncle, aunt you have in the marketplace to try to get it going. Then you get to more professional capital at seed, Series A rounds, and venture capital funding. We've raised over 150 million over the years. These Series A, B. Last fall, we closed a Series D round of financing at $65 million. Some marquee investors are part of that syndicate. And so that's kind of where we are today. And typically to run phase 3 trials, these are typically a couple $100 million, given the long-term nature of following these patients. So that gives you the capital ideas. I mean, many of it, again, what's really interesting about the story of ONL in Michigan, it's early Michigan angels supporting innovation out of the university, got the company going, and then ultimately secured some venture capital fund. But, that's where, having done this now most of my 30 plus years, more than half of it's been in these early stage startups, is it's super exciting to think friends, families, and people that are really want to support innovation are willing to put their own, this is their own personal capital. I can remember in a number of these ventures, you're walking around getting personal checks from people, and it's a really cool feeling. But then ultimately, you need a lot bigger venture capital funds to be able to move it forward that way.
And so if you're having a conversation with one of these potential investors, can you provide the basic framework for what the ROI and timeline could look like for that such investor?
Sure. So this is high risk investments for sure. When you look at the percentage of drug discovery work that comes out of a lab, passes through animal studies, successfully through human studies, we're talking single digit percentages that ultimately get to commercialization. So this is not for the weak or faint of heart. This is high risk investments. But the discussion goes, the base parameters of what's the value of the company, what's that all sets the price, and all those with term sheets determine today we may be worth 5 million, then 10 million. You determine that. You determine a set of value inflection points that say, for example, we're raising $50 million. What is that 50 million going to do over the next 2 years? And in our world, it would be generating data that shows the potential of the drug, which would increase value of that investment. Those are a bit of the kind of blocking and tackling components of the investment thesis. I need 50 million to deliver this study, and these will be the value inflection points along that study. And then, Jim, to your point, ultimately valuation is then what's the addressable market? What do you think a commercial plan for pricing could be? And I can tell you, for a type of investment in ONL and others in this space, the markets are big. The commercialization plan is not as challenging as, say, these broader markets going after, say, primary care docs. So these are, billion, 2-3 billion potential exit valuations for companies. So depending on the stage of that investment, you can do the math on what could be 7, 8, 10 times an investment. That's really exciting. One of those companies I mentioned that did get FDA approval in the space we're competing in, they were acquired by a large pharma company, but for $6 billion just a few years ago. So you can imagine a company starting with what may be a 5, 10, 15, $20 million valuation. And granted, we've passed a few more valuation clicks than that over the last couple of years, but those kind of exit potentials give investors a good bit of hope that you could get there. But as I said earlier, these are high risk. The unfortunate reality in drug discovery, not many of them make it all the way, but you do hope the scientific learnings get passed on to others so that they can hopefully move the ball forward a little.
Yeah. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you say single digit percentage of these companies actually make it to the finish line, that would be based at a very early stage part of the process, whereas now you're have made some serious progress through that process. So I would imagine that where would you put yourself percentage wise now? Are we in the 20s, the 50s, the 70s? Where would you mark that?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I mean, this study now, so in our phase 1 programs, we had a combination of, across a number of different studies, 30 plus patients in each study. So round up maybe 100 total in dosing. So, we feel the drug is very safe, which is a very important criteria of moving forward. This study right now is on the efficacy challenge, so is it safe for a few years, and does it really slow progression of the disease? I tell you what, I'll be a little bold here and say we've already raised the capital for it. No, we probably got a 50-50 chance of seeing how this thing goes. But yeah, you just never know. We're into the throes of it right now. We're feeling pretty bullish. The management team's feeling bullish. But it's the reality check now by running a trial this big.
And the ROI for the investor in terms of timeline and duration? We're talking 5 to 10 years out.
Well, I think it's interesting, Jim, in our space, typically um, passing through a successful phase 2 study, that's
Hmm.
typically when a lot of your bigger players, your big pharma players, look to acquire assets because then they like to plan the phase 3 studies that ultimately give them the ability to sell on those labels that you get proven in the phase 3 study. So it's not uncommon for a company like ours to deliver a really good phase 2 data package in one of the big pharma companies saying, I like that market, I like that drug and data, and sweep in on an acquisition. So or the other side of it is we continue to raise capital and then IPO the company for a potential liquidation event that way, getting into the public markets and people could trade it daily. So, I think that's kind of the strategic options for us going forward. And we'll just see. It really comes down to the quality of the data and how interested a lot of the bigger players are on it. So that could be a very sizable return for investors at our stage. As I mentioned, that company that did get approval a couple of years ago, sold for $6.5 billion. That's a big number, and so we'll see. I think we're hoping for the best, but we got to get the work done now.
So let's shift gears a little bit and just talk about the different variety of engagement approaches that you've been able to implement so far. What's worked? What's not worked? What is it that you're exploring and maybe leveraging technology or external partners with?
Sure. So one of the things, and certainly, gets to some of the AI components. So when we think about where we are right now with zelafacilitide, our lead compound, we like to have backup compounds just in case the lead one doesn't work out. We think blocking this pathway is important. There's other ways to block it. So we do, now have the ability to look at backup structures of peptides much more efficiently with some of these tools now than we ever had before. How do you really draw up a new small peptide? What would you make? What components would you add to it, take away from it? So we can accelerate the identification of backup compounds to build much quicker with some of the tools. So that's an exciting part of our going forward. The other part on the blocking and tackling of running the clinical trial is how we, as I mentioned earlier, how do we identify patients quickly? So there are some AI models now that look throughout an electronic medical record, look throughout a patient's images over time. You or I and an optometrist or a ophthalmologist or a retina specialist, all the images they take to begin to kind of grind that through a big data algorithm to ultimately say, of these 5,000 patients in my clinic, these five hit the perfect criteria that are eligible for those trials. So that's another tool we're using to try to accelerate the identifying of patients, other than what would be the old school way of clicking through images on a computer and looking in a hard copy roster. We're using those tools quite a bit to make progress a bit quicker. I think on the money raising, since we raised last year, we're just now beginning to frame out, what would be nice outreach tools to use to identify investors' level of interest, how much dry powder they have in their fund to invest. Those tools we haven't yet dialed into, but we will as we go to raise capital for the next round.
And what do some of those tools look like?
Yeah. So on the data aggregation side, to your comment earlier, we do work with partners on those tools. There's a couple companies that are building those aggregation tools, and so we align with retina clinics across the country to ultimately support those tools. That's how we do it that way. On the Salesforce has tools on the outreach component to ultimately be able to identify funds where they are at certain states. So there are those kind of big aggregators of traditional sales and outreach tools that CRM managers that ultimately can help us identify the right investors. At the end of the day, Jim, I found even with all these tools, at least on the outreach side, it's still a little bit old school. You got to knock on a lot of doors. You got to pick up the phone and you got to hope for the best going out there.
Yeah, well, I was curious that generally speaking, that's the hardest part, is once you've identified a target list of that ICP that you're attempting a contact. What is the catalyst for sparking up a conversation? Through what medium channel? Is it email outreach? Is it LinkedIn outreach? Is it or through other methods, maybe direct advertisement?
Great. No, great point. So what we don't do is some of the direct advertising or pay clicks for awareness. What we typically are using very much, it is usually a data point, very much from investors. They don't want to get hounded with no news. So we typically are trying to stage our outreaches around these value inflection points on a data point. We maybe hit full, or we opened up our trial. So we had first few patients enrolled. That's a data point. Hey, we're in business and open up that trial. So that begins the cycle of communications. Typically it's email communication or perhaps phone or text to people that we're really close to, but typically it's email awareness out directly to specific investors. Occasionally, LinkedIn's been a great tool to find new investors and find out where they're doing. So that's typically it. And then from there, depending on their interest in our pathway and our journey, we'll set the pace for the repetition of communications. If they want to dig in deeper sooner, we certainly are, we've got data room access and those kind of things. But then also many of them may just be, hey, I'll wait to your next inflection point of data. And typically for us, that would be when we hit full enrollment or perhaps when we open up Europe. So that's usually the connections. In the life science world, there are a number of conferences we attend also to meet face-to-face. Things like the JP Morgan Healthcare Conferences, January every year. We meet a lot there. Bio has a number of investor conferences as well. That's a big trade organization for the biotech industry. And that's usually what gets you into that repetition of consistent face-to-face meetings. And then ultimately, when you're getting to a term sheet, you're usually showing up at that firm, that venture firm's offices, making the final pitch to full partners, and you hope it goes your way.
And so in terms of making progress on the biggest obstacle that's in front of you, what core metrics are you tracking on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis to know that you're moving the needle?
Sure. So in our clinical trial, there are things like it starts off with regulatory approval. What regulatory bodies around the world have approved the trial. So we have a set plan for those, and we're really watching those ultimately get approved over time. And then once the country gets approved, then it becomes site level activation. So literally we have 120 plus sites across the globe. So what countries have been approved, what sites are on our hit list from there, and then from there, how do we see those metrics unfold with what's called site initiation visits to ultimately say your doors are now open, site in Ann Arbor, Michigan, start looking for patients. That's that piece. And then the other key metric is once the doors open for the site, how many patients have they screened? What's their rate of screening patients? And then ultimately, what's their rate of eligible patients and then enrolled patients? So that common dashboard, Jim, starts at a big map. Countries, are we approved there? Within those countries, what are the site approval plans? And then from in there is how we're finding patients, getting it going. So that creates the framework of a pretty efficient dashboard to then go in and problem solve. One of the common ones is, sites that may have screened a lot of patients, but they're not enrolling a lot. So are they not really efficient at screening the right patients? Are they looking all over the place as opposed to the direct patients we'd want them to get to? So that goes a step further beyond that dashboard to find out what's going on.
I see. And what CRM are you using to track these metrics on the dashboard?
We use a variety of them through our contract research groups that have a variety of tools that way. I can tell you our investor outreach is still old school Excel, that we have formulas built in doing that. But our CRO teams have a number of electronic databases, EDCs, that kind of assess that and tools. But I will say that's where, the aggregation of some of those is where some of these newer AI tools hopefully can get some efficiencies because, like it or not, a lot of this stuff, certainly at the site level, is a paper requisition form. I'm giving you an eye chart. I'm filling the thing out while I'm looking at you, and then I input it into a database. So there's a lot of still cross-checking on systems like that may seem pretty old school to most.
No doubt. And so if we fast forward a year from now, David, and you've nailed it, what does success look like?
Sure. For us, the study will be fully enrolled at this time next year. So that means 325 patients or so will be active and enrolled in the study, and we'll have the last patient enrolled. And what that means is our primary endpoint in the study is 12 months after that date. So at the end of next year, we'll have fully enrolled the trial. We'll keep those patients in, and then 12 months from there, we'll have our primary endpoint to determine how well the drug did in the study. Those would be the big ones, and in order to do that, we have to have all those countries aligned that we're going into, all those sites, all the things we did. But the real benchmark is fully enrolled study, and then we're waiting 12 months after that to get the primary endpoint.
Got it. David, was there anything else specifically that you wanted to highlight in this conversation that we haven't talked about already?
Did you want to just say one thing to your audience that somewhat doesn't always get fully appreciated when people think about biotech, drug discovery, and all that? A lot of times you may read in the reports online or CNBC and these shows about all these just like crazy exits and billion-dollar revenue drivers and all that kind of stuff. That's all well and good. I would just want the audience to know that there's a lot of really solid, purposeful work, research going on by people that are working hard every day to solve really complex scientific problems. And many of those don't see the light of day. Nobody's posting on Instagram the 5 different peptides or backup compounds that didn't work, the adverse event that ended a program. Nobody's sharing those kind of things. But the world of scientific innovation is moving forward by a lot of good people that not everybody is fully aware of unless you're knee deep in this stuff. And just because it doesn't flash up on a good highlight reel online or a news channel, just people should know there's just good purposeful work solving some really complicated diseases, and we hope for the betterment of mankind.
Well, good on you, David. We certainly need more people like you out in the world doing the hard work and getting things done. You reminded me of somebody told me in the past before is how many times did Edison attempt to create the light bulb before it actually worked? Yeah, nobody remembers that other 1,000 or 10,000 times efforts, tries, failures.
Yeah. No, it's true. You don't remember how many late nights he spent in that lab and how many times he probably slammed the door when it didn't work. That's so true.
Well, thanks for pulling back the curtain on how ONL is rethinking engagement in medtech. For listeners, we'll link to ONL Therapeutics and David's profile. If you enjoyed the episode, follow Trust AI Partners and share it with a colleague in life sciences. David, thanks again for joining us. And is there a final handoff if somebody wants to connect with you, get more information? Where's the best place to find you?
Sure, Jim. First off, it's a pleasure being on your program. Really appreciate the work you're doing and spreading the word on these things. And yeah, the audience can find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active that way, or ONL Therapeutics, be able to track me down.
All right. That's all for today. We'll see you on the next one.